Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and tonight we are going to follow up on our discussion from our last episode where we were looking at how do we find our way in the world, and we want to talk specifically about this idea of how do we find our vision? How do we discover what it is that's really going to move and drive our life? So I'm happy you're here with us today, and let's jump right in. Briefly, just want to restate that one of the things that we talked about last week was the need for vision, because without it, we find ourselves with a lack of direction. It's kind of like we got together with the family and we decided we wanted to go out for dinner, and we got in the car and we started driving, but we hadn't figured out what we were going to have for dinner yet. How do you know which way to go? You're just kind of directionless, and you may end up picking something for dinner that you didn't really want, but you just kind of ended up there because that's the direction you were driving. So in life, if we don't have a clear idea of our vision that we're trying to achieve and what frames our life, we can find ourselves someplace that we didn't intend to be, but there we are. So we want to take a little bit of time and just kind of pause to really think through this idea of vision and what does it mean for who we are and how we live our lives. A couple of things we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about this, though, and that is there's also kind of this idea of subvisions. So there could be aspects of our life where we have goals or visions of things that we want to have done, where maybe I'm passionate about playing music, and maybe I've got a vision about being a rock star, or I love to paint and so I want to go into art or computer science, and any of those levels, stuff that you want to do with family, the idea of the types of lifestyle that you want to live, how much money you want to make. These would all be kind of visions that direct aspects of our life, but they're kind of more at the personal level. They aren't necessarily all encompassing. They focus on particular aspects. And while we need those, and those are important, we still have this kind of larger or core vision that we want to talk about and have some ideas about, because ultimately even our subvisions should be working in conjunction with our core vision. We're going to find a little bit of disconnect in our life. The more that we're in coherence between what our vision is, our goal, our worldview for life, and how we're living our life, the more those are in sync, the more fulfilling, natural, authentic our life is going to feel. When we are living a way of life that's a bit different from what we think life should be or how we understand our big picture worldview, things aren't going to feel authentic for us. So that's why we want to have that coherence, but we often don't spend too much time to stop and think about what that real core level vision for life is. So how do we know what that is? How do we get there? Well, the way that I find myself going back to this and how I kind of understand what it is for me is when I think about death. Death is this aspect of life that has a way of defining everything about it. So we come into life, and at some point we recognize that we are going to die. And death has got two real key characteristics that impact us. One is it's inevitable. Nobody gets out of life alive. And the other part is it's uncertain in terms of we don't know when it's going to happen. We may live to be 110 years old, or, as they say, you might get hit by a bus tomorrow. Fortunately, I don't live someplace that has a lot of buses, so maybe I'm a little bit safe from that particular threat. But the point is, when death is part of the picture, it disrupts, not in a planned way, not in a way where we have a chance to kind of, I take that back. There could be times where we do have opportunity to plan. We may have a diagnosis or something where we learn that we do have more of a set number of days and we can work to get our life in order. But in general, the problem that we have with death is that it can strike at unexpected times and bring to termination the different projects or things that we're working on, the things that we care about, our relationships. And because of that, we wonder, well, does life have any meaning? So part of this core vision is answering the question about meaning, about significance, in light of the fact that we die. So for a lot of people, the natural way that this is kind of resolved for them is usually through religion. Religion is one of its core aspects, is dealing with the question of death, and is that the end, and what does life mean in light of death, and what kind of death is important, or how do you want to live your life in light of that. But whether you're looking at more of a religious perspective on this or some other perspective, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, death, at the one hand, where it seems to be so disruptive, also brings a certain amount of clarity to life. It brings a definition to it that otherwise would be hard to express. That in a certain sense, because we die, because life is short, relatively short, everything matters. It brings an urgency to the things that we do, a significance to them, a way of focusing our attention. If life was never ending, it would very quickly be hard to distinguish one from another, that there isn't that kind of urgency. It would be that ongoing, almost kind of a monotonous thing that we think, well, I would never run out of things to do. I mean, I want to live a long time, and I can think of stuff I would do and all these different projects and things I'd want to solve and things I'd want to understand. Okay, so let's say you've figured out stuff for 1,000 years, right? What about the next billion years? It's like, there's no way, at least with who we are as human beings, that we would have a way of being able to structure and organize that kind of time in a way that would make sense or have meaning. And we would know this almost immediately because we would know that we don't die. So in a weird kind of way, death introduces this idea of significance into life because it becomes significant, it becomes precious, it's unique, it's this one moment in time that you don't get to have back, and you don't get do-overs, and so it adds this level of meaning and significance to it. But again, when we're thinking about this idea of core worldview, we're thinking about how do we understand and think about our vision for life, our worldview, what is the meaning, what is the significance? And specifically because of the nature of death. It's those big, big questions. Not just the idea of my personal likes and dislikes or things that I want to pursue, as important as those are. It's that grander scheme of things. So what if I become a rock star, but then I die? You still got that bigger question of, well, what was the significance? And some of us are happy with the idea, well, at least I got to do that. And we don't think much beyond there. But for those of us that are like, wrestle with these bigger questions of significance and meaning, this is a good time to every once in a while just kind of pause and stop and think about, how does this all fit together? So we might start with, where does it come from? Where do we get our core vision or our core worldview from? Well, for most of us, we inherit it. We are born into this world where there's assumptions about worldviews from our parents, from those around us, that we just kind of absorb. There's not a specific point where we're trying to specifically learn or pick out or choose the worldview. We just kind of end up with one. And for a lot of us, that's fine, and it never really changes. But at some point, for some people, something will happen in life that makes you stop, and it makes you question, what do I really know about life? Or why do I think that this is important? Or is this way of thinking about reality real? Is it correct? Is it true? There's times where we might find things that challenge the way that we've perceived and thought about the world, and this can bring about a bigger change then, where we might have questions about our worldview, about our vision for life. And so what brings that about? It could be something like a lack of coherence, where maybe we're learning more about the nature of reality, and this worldview that we've had doesn't quite match up. They don't line up, and we're not quite sure what to do with that. Or maybe we had beliefs about certain things that helped us to deal with the question of death, and then when we're confronted with death, either our own or our loved one, or maybe somebody we don't even know, but it just seems very tragic, and we're like, how does this work? My belief system that was helping me through that isn't working right now. And so we end up kind of rethinking and challenging what our initial core worldview, our vision, is. I want to just tell you a little bit about my journey, because this is important to me, because it's a process that I'm actually going through, and I'm not even actually, through it. It's something I'm in the process of working out as we speak. But, for me, if I think about my history, my past, how I grew up, the worldview that I inherited, it was probably kind of maybe what you might call a generically Christian worldview. My parents weren't super religious, but they did find it was important to go to church. The church that they went to was one that was a little bit more on the liberal side of things. And I remember when I was younger, there's a time where they have what they call confirmation. So this particular Christian church, you were baptized into it as an infant. And so in a very real sense, this is that idea of inheriting a worldview where it's just kind of hoisted upon you, whether you chose it or not. It just kind of happens. But then at a certain point, there's this idea that you're going to choose it for yourself, that you're going to own it. And this is this idea with confirmation. And this is like in 6th grade or something like that. So I'm not quite sure how they figure that as a 6th grader, you're at a position where you're able to make those kinds of life decisions or understand enough about life to do that. But whatever the case, this is what it was. And it did get me thinking and asking questions about, well, what is this faith and what does it mean? And I remember having a conversation with the pastor and asking, I think at the time it was about the virgin birth. And what do we understand? What do we know about that? And the pastor was like, well, there's a lot of different perspectives that people have. Some people take this as a literal truth, and other people see it as a little bit more maybe metaphorical, or possibly something that was used to make a point, but they didn't actually take seriously. And I didn't really have, maybe in 6th grade, the wherewithal to have the kind of appreciation maybe that I should have had for more of the metaphorical way of thinking about things. I just remembered thinking, well, in Christianity, if this is like, if the Bible is the document, the thing that defines what you believe, and yet people aren't sure if they can take it seriously, why take Christianity seriously if that's the case? And again, I was a young guy at the time, and it was a little bit more black and white for me at the time. And that really made me struggle, to the point where I didn't really want to go through with confirmation, because I wasn't sure it was something I felt like I wanted to commit to, or something that I could say that I fully believed in. But I had other pressures on me, which was I didn't want my mom to feel upset that I didn't go through with it. So I remember making the decision to go ahead and go through with the confirmation, even though I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with that. And this was really kind of the beginning of this questioning and thinking through this inherited worldview that I had. I remember going into high school that I started exploring different types of philosophies, and Taoism was something that was pretty interesting to me, more as a philosophy than as a religion. And I think for a while there, I got exposed to transcendental meditation and just different ways of kind of thinking about things. But I still felt like I needed something to like hang my hat on, something that was giving me kind of this sure foundation about what does life mean and how are we supposed to live it? It was very ambiguous at this point in my life, and I probably felt a little directionless about which way to go, even though there was part of me that was very excited about this freedom and openness that I had, without feeling like I was bound to this way of thinking that I was kind of inherited. Well, it was a little while after high school that I ended up becoming exposed to another kind of form of Christianity that was what I might call thinking Christianity. It was more along the lines of, don't just take our word for it, study it for yourself and understand what it's saying. It took a lot of concern about history, started to look at culture, and for me, I was like, wow, this is a different way of thinking about it. This is not the kind of Christianity where you had to park your brain on the doorstep before you could come inside. And so I was intrigued by that. And honestly, it propelled me forward for a number of years where I felt like here was something I could get behind. Here was something that had a foundation because it stood up to my investigation. And I pursued that for many years. I became very involved. I got involved with, in a certain sense, like apologetics, where you're out there kind of defending the faith, so you might say, with other people. I wasn't really out there trying to convert other people, but when people had different ideas and they wanted to kind of argue about them, I found that a lot of fun at that time. I know that probably doesn't sound like fun for a lot of people, but it was for me. And maybe it's just because I get concerned about these big level meaning of life questions. It's just something maybe that's wired into my DNA, but that's where I was. Well, then crisis hits again, because the particular denomination that I had become so passionate about went through a remarkable rethinking who they are, and in fact made a number of significant doctrinal changes because they, in their opinion, had been wrong on them. Now, you don't hear this very often from a church, and so I have to really respect them for doing that, but it threw me for a loop because I thought I knew what I was talking about. I thought I knew what this world was about and what truth was. And here, this thing that I was able to defend with other people and that I had spent all this time making sure I understood correctly, I was now being confronted with this idea that it was wrong. And as I studied their reasons for claiming that it was wrong, I had to agree. So my whole world was just being turned upside down. Again, I was a bit directionless. Where am I supposed to go in life? Interestingly enough, this was all happening shortly before Y2K. So it just added to the confusion and wanting to understand even more so, what should I be thinking? Where should I hold on? How, life questions. What is it all about? Well, it sent me into another cycle of basically saying, I want to just forget everything that I thought I know and start from scratch. Now, as much as I said that, that wasn't exactly what I did. I still started from a bit of my prior orientation in the sense that Christianity had been that thing that I thought was that foundation. And I hadn't fully shaken that. It was still something that was there. I guess I was thinking that maybe I just had the wrong idea about it. And if I approached it more carefully, if I was more rigorous in my academic approach, if I tried to make sure that I was uncovering my own blind spots and hearing critiques from other people and reading diversely amongst lots of different scholars, that maybe I would be able to get it right this time. And this led me on another really interesting, exciting part of my life where I ended up going back to graduate school and got a master's in divinity, and really pursued this in a way that was quite passionate because, again, I really wanted to know. My my concern above all was about truth, and my basic stance was truth doesn't have anything to fear from open and honest investigation. I did have a number of Christian friends who tried to warn me. They're like, Jim, you got to be careful because you may end up studying yourself out of believing. And to me, I thought, how does that even make sense? If it's possible that you could study your way out of believing something, wouldn't that mean that the thing that you're believing didn't hold up? And if it doesn't, isn't that a good thing? Well, again, this is somebody who's maybe struggling with what their worldview was, and they didn't want to be confronted with a change. They did not want to be left directionless. And this is, of course, the big crisis with worldviews and visions, that if your vision of life and meaning and purpose changes, that leaves you kind of in midair. And that's not a comfortable place to be. So I understand why people are put up boundaries to help prevent that from accidentally happening, where they can protect their position and not have to worry about confronting some of these other ideas. So for me, again, this worked for a period of time where I was able to really dive deep, bringing in, again, these additional ways of looking at it, where it wasn't just, looking at the Bible or just some particular theological or doctrinal position from a particular church, but more broadly read, not specifically denominationally oriented, bringing in other disciplines like cultural anthropology, social linguistics, that were shedding all sorts of fascinating lights on ancient scripture and new ways to understand it that kind of threw a lot of the traditional ways of reading it upside down. That really fueled my whole, again, vision, my worldview, and how I was moving forward. And other people were excited about it too. But then, as we were moving forward, and as I was involved with various folks that we were studying and diving deep into this stuff, curious things started happening where they ended up kind of one by one leaving not just the group, but Christianity. And this was a little disheartening, because I thought that what I was doing is helping people to embrace and come into a more full and honest, understanding and belief system and way of life. And what I had done in exposing them to these different ways of looking at life is they began to question some of the core foundational aspects of Christianity, to the point where, like my friend was concerned about this idea of studying yourself out of believing, well, that kind of happened for them. And I guess there was a part in me that was also happening, but I didn't want to face it because of how much I had invested in this direction, how much other people had invested and participated and helped to work with this church that we were doing, and participating in the life changes with my family had to put up with going through all of this. And so there was kind of some reasons not to just go easily let go of this. But the more I was honest with myself, continuing that prior foundation of wanting to seek truth first and foremost, and that truth didn't have anything to fear from investigation, I had to become a little bit more honest with myself that I had gotten to a point where a supernatural worldview was not working for me. Where I had become was more of what they would call a naturalist, in the sense of a philosophical naturalist. That's essentially looking at the world as basically everything is natural. There isn't any specifically supernatural. Now, some people are much more dogmatic about that than I am. I'm more at the point right now where I'm not ruling out the possibility of some supernatural force or deity or non-material aspect, but I guess I'm kind of looking to see, I'm not finding the space where that hole is that needs to fill, that even though we don't understand everything, obviously, about, physics and science and all the things that we understand there, we understand enough that we can see how these mechanisms work, and there's just not this reason to need to posit something like this supernatural influence. People have experiences, and not trying to invalidate the experiences happen, but there's just a difference in how we're interpreting what that experience is. But I want to be really clear. This transition for me is not a way of me saying that I have outgrown Christianity, or that Christianity is below me, or that if somebody's still in Christianity or any other kind of religion, that somehow that they are not as enlightened or anything like that. This is me personally with my own particular struggles based off of what I know, or what I've come to understand through my studies. And I am not settled on this issue, so I am not evaluating this as a positive, negative in terms of somebody being in religion or out of religion. But I do find myself in a position where I find it more important for me to be able to ask questions and pursue those questions than to be limited by not wanting to ruffle traditional feathers or not wanting to upset dogma. So I'm kind of in this weird space right now where, there's a lot of aspects about Christianity in terms of that, speaking truth to power, the concern for those who are most marginalized, this overall vision of seeking shalom, this idea of all of creation being at a point of harmony and justice and balance. I think those are all really awesome ideas, but some of the core aspects, the supernatural aspects, I've come to have quite a problem with, and so that's put me in a strange place. And so I'm working that out, and maybe that's why I'm thinking a lot right now about core visions or worldviews, and how do these play out, and how do they have an impact on our life. One of the things that you think through this is like, well, can you just pick one? And it's like, worldviews and visions are interesting because they have or need to have this ability to capture your imagination, to capture your desire, to really fuel this momentum to engage and potentially sacrifice and work hard for things. And so when there's a crack in that, and you start to see around the corner, and something's not matching up, that coherence isn't there, it's weird. It's like as soon as you notice that, you can't go back. It's not like I could ever go back to where I was at before, because it would feel inauthentic. It would not, again, be matching up correctly. And at the same time, you can't just say, well, okay, I see the benefits of having faith or having a religion, so you can't just make something up either, because that doesn't work. It has to be something else. And so, what do we do with that? Is there a way to do something new, to redefine what is the good life, or that vision of what is good that captures that imagination, to strive after it? I'm starting to think that rather than coming up with something out of whole cloth, that maybe what seems to be the case more historically, and maybe will continue to happen, is more of an evolution of these worldviews or these visions that comes to incorporate more of what we know about reality, so that it comes back into this level of cohesion where there can be this sense of authenticity. And I think that's probably where I see things leading, and I don't have all the answers for that right now. It is something that I plan on continuing to address at different ways as we continue through this series. And really, for whatever your worldview is, whatever your vision is, where I really want to focus on is how do we get there? How do we go through that transformation in ourselves, in our environments, to make those visions, those worldviews a reality? And it's not going to matter a whole lot about, if we're on the same page as far as those visions are, because how we go about doing personal transformation is really going to come to play in very similar ways. But in thinking then about what this might look like going forward, I think the key things are going to be, one, that, at least for how I'm looking at this, there's, as we've talked about in past episodes, two different worlds that we inhabit. There's the world of meaning, which is commonly referred to as this idea of myth, and again, not in terms of falsity, but in terms of defining what things mean, the significance of things in this world. And we live in the world of reality in the sense of more the objective side of things. So there's the subjective and the objective. But what's really interesting is that historically, how we've grown up, the subjective was the primary. It's a pretty recent thing that we've gotten this idea of objective reality that's taken on the significance that it has. And I am not putting that down in any way. As you know from watching the show, I'm a big fan of what science has helped us to understand about the nature of reality. But what I'm also understanding is that we live in a world of meanings and values, and this is kind of the big struggle that we're having from more of a naturalist perspective on things, more of a scientific perspective of things, is that meaning and purpose and value are not inherent in the natural universe. But yet we need them in order to navigate life, to understand what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. And so where do they come from? And again, religion is one of the primary ways this comes into play, but there has to be some other ways that we can think about understanding this besides just more of those traditional views, because for more and more people like myself, they're not working out like they used to. And this ambiguity that we find ourselves in, I think, is one of the things that leads to this, I think, significant sense of anxiety in our world. A lot of things don't feel certain. Direction is not really clear. The things that are happening on the political scene, the things that are happening on the economic scene, there's social changes that are happening, and we don't feel like we have a way to evaluate these things. There's so much that's happening in terms of different, I hate to use the term political correctness, but things like that, where there's so many groups that are coming up with things that they're concerned about, that they're wanting to enforce on other people. Everybody's just kind of like, I don't even know how to turn. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to look at somebody without offending anybody. So we're kind of in this strange space that we need to spend some time and find our bearings and try and sort this thing out. And for me, part of it from that science view is we've learned a lot about what humans need in order to flourish, in order for us to experience well-being. And so as I'm looking at these things, that's what I'm going to be keeping an eye to. There's definitely three key things that have been at the top of everybody's list when they go through what do humans really need. And one of them is attachment, and that's this idea of connection, of relationship, of our social nature. We are at a foundational level wired to connect. We have to connect. So whatever we're looking at going forward, that's going to have to be an aspect of it. How do we maintain healthy, solid relationships and build those kinds of connections? There's this other idea of affectance, which is kind of a strange word, but it's like affect in terms of like being able to actually accomplish something. And I think this is really pulling on kind of this idea of flow, where we achieve a lot more of a sense of well-being as a human when we're making progress on things, more so than when we actually accomplish something. Accomplishments are good, but then once you accomplish it, that feeling's it dissipates quickly. But this ongoing being able to be challenged by something that's within enough of our skill set that we are able to successfully engage with it, but not so easy that it's too easy for us and not too hard that we can't accomplish it. There's kind of that sweet spot where we can get involved in it, whether it's a sport or some aspect of work or reading a story or something, where we just we get absorbed by it. We lose track of time and things around us, and we just are immersed in whatever that activity is. This sense of flow is really important for our sense of well-being, and to feel like we're actually able to accomplish and do something in this world seems to be something that's really built into us as well, in that affectance, that category. And the third one is transcendence. And I know that this tends to sound more on the religious side, but it has much more to do with this idea of being caught up in something that's bigger than ourselves. And this is true whether you're talking from a religious context or otherwise. This need to feel like we can give ourselves over to something that has meaning, that has significance beyond just us. The things that we find important and matter to us and give us pleasure are absolutely important as well. But there's this other kind of vertical dimension that we need to engage, this elation that seems to be involved with that kind of higher purpose kind of an idea. So whatever this ends up looking like as we continue down this journey of sorting out our adopting a vision of finding our worldview, finding our vision, those are going to be some key things that I'm personally looking for. But along the way, as we're developing our perspective of what this vision might be, we'll also be looking at the aspects of how do we engage in personal transformation, how do we engage in practices that help us to learn how to achieve our goals and our steps along the way, and other aspects of well-being, both for us personally and for our community. So I hope you'll continue this journey with me as we explore these aspects about life and well-being. I am just finding it very therapeutic in a personal sense, going through this process. This isn't exactly what I was expecting when we started Kinship Cafe, but it's definitely a direction that is taking me, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you for joining us. Looking forward to seeing you next week, and be well.